Hi, everyone, and welcome back to episode 2, I suppose, of the Dungeon Master's Journal for the adventure that I'm running out of the Abyss, D&D 5th edition campaign supplement. So we just played our second session last night, and I learned some things as a DM, that's for sure. If you watched my first episode, one of the things I had mentioned is that this is kind of my first time really taking the reins in a larger project as a DM. I've dabbled here and there, but never anything as in depth as the story being offered with Out of the Abyss and the kind of time commitment that it represents. So, so we did session 2 last night. I'm not going to do a total recap of our previous session as to how we got here because you can watch the other video for that. But in a nutshell, the players all started off as prisoners of the Drow in the Underdark. And our previous session basically was them figuring out a way to overcome that, escape that, their experience as being prisoners, and then just narrowly making it out of that under a lot of duress kind of thing. So our last session was a lot of really good role play. They met a lot of cool NPCs who were like fellow prisoners with them. They also there was some combat, but the combat was almost mostly narrative in form. So it was, I think it was challenging, but it wasn't overbearing. Last night's session represented a couple lessons for me as a dungeon master. I think pacing was one of them. I think that combat difficulty was one of them. And to always be wary of the evils that the PC's dice rolls can be. And I'll get to more of what that means later. All right, so anyways, so basically, to set the scene for you a little bit again, by players, I had one missing again. It was a different one this time, so we were still at a party base of 4, and then plus all of the NPCs who had successfully escaped Velkenvelv, which was the Drow outpost, with them. So my players were Bard, the half-orc barbarian, was... Sorry, I'm blanking on names here. Sir Robert, the human paladin, as well as Uta, the turtle monk, and then my half elf warlock from last time, Colby, who was not present for this session last night. But we did have our new addition, who was supposed to be there for the first session, but couldn't make it due to unforeseen circumstances. He is playing a character named Ken LaFlaunt, who is another half-elf, and he is a half-elf bard. So now we've got a half-elf bard and a bard half-orc barbarian, and we hope that won't get confusing. But no, so... Excuse me. So he joined the party in a way where they kind of, after a couple days of travel on their way to Sloopludock, which is the Kuatoa settlement that they kind of chose to go to because it was the nearest bit of civilization from where they started the whole adventure. They kind of found him one night after taking shelter when foraging for food, and he was just kind of wandering around the Underdark naked for who knows how long. It could have been weeks, it could have been months, or according to the player character, maybe even years of just barely surviving off what he could scrounge. But having a similar kind of backstory of being a former prisoner of Velkenvelv and managing to just kind of get away on his own. Just slip away somehow. But it was only one prisoner that got away, so the Drow maybe weren't as intensive about tracking him down. Whereas the PCs, especially with some of the kind of info from the NPCs, especially like, for example, Sereth, who is another dark elf who is actually a prisoner with them, are pretty sure, Jorlin... or sorry, not Jorlin, Shore, one of the kind of primary Dark Elf guards from Velkenvelv, 100% saw them escaping the prison during this kind of end of session battle last time. So they're pretty certain that they're probably going to be tracked not too soon after escaping with all the demons that were flying around. Once that whole situation was settled down at Velkenvelv, pretty sure a hunting party was going to be sent out after them. So they find Ken LaFlante, and that was a great scene. Again, provided some great role playing opportunities for not just Ken to kind of cut his teeth on where everything's at and who everyone is, but also just everyone else to kind of be like, well. Okay, so crazy dude wandering around the Underdark, and I mean, he seems harmless. I guess he can come with us, and one of the lessons that I guess I really didn't mention at the start that I learned as a DM is how useful this little group of NPCs can be, because their personality is set. How they are is really well defined in a lot of different ways to you as the DM in this book, and so. I'm able to sometimes help things along through them as characters. So, for example, it's not as though my other PCs were going to shoo this person away, because as much as it might be odd to find someone wandering around in the Underdark and just invite them into your camp, at the same time, we all know that we're building a story here and my players are not problematic. But, there is the necessary amount of caution, and to grease the wheels, so to speak, I basically had Eldith, who is, this kind of stout and virtuous and honor-bound shield dwarf scout from Gauntlgrim. She basically kind of came halfway into the conversation and was like, oh my god, you poor man, everything that you've been through, and kind of do the whole throw a blanket over him and here, come eat some of this mushroom stuff that we foraged as food. So that really helped move things along as well, and I think everyone was appreciative of that. And that's when kind of I decided to also kick off the first type of I mean, I guess you can call it an encounter. It's not really an encounter, more of an event. So essentially, the characters, they take watch for guarding, during the night, and the way they did it is we said, okay, there's going to be 3 shifts of guards. One of the PCs took on the first, and then a couple groups of NPCs took on second and third. And the second and third watch was Bapido, the little kind of chippy little Darrow, which is odd for a Darrow, as well as Prince Darendel, who is the high elf prince who looks like a Quagoth because he was polymorphed by a evil wizard kind of thing. And again, more on that in a second. But they took last watch, and in the morning time, they're all getting ready to leave, and one of the other prisoners, Jim Jar, is kind of like, hey, something's different. Like, I feel like we're missing something. And they're kind of looking around, and so Prince Darendel is nowhere to be found. And my Sir Robert, my paladin there, my player paladin, had really kind of grown attached in some such way to Prince Darendel. I think because as in a role play, his character is noble, and here is this elf prince, this wood elf prince. So right there, they're like, oh, here's someone that my character, I guess, will kind of identify with. And Darendel gave him a great reaction as well, because Prince Darendel basically said, oh my god, finally, someone of noble blood. So, it was a fun little connection there. And on top of that, the player just thought it was really neat, this idea of like, oh, there's this like hulking beast. Literally, the comparison that was made after our first session was he's kind of like Beast from X-Men. He's this kind of smart, well-spoken, big hairy monster that can rip you apart. So that was he really liked that character, and so because of that, some of the players, especially Ken, who had just got there, Ken LaFlante, basically were like, well, let's be honest, guys, it's the Underdark. He's dead. He's probably dead. It's likely that something ate him. So that was kind of a lot of the response. But the paladin said no. We're finding him. I'm not leaving another one behind, which was in reference to, what may have been perceived as a personal failing to save the orc Ront during the escape, who was ultimately eaten by a gray ooze kind of thing. So he was like, no, we're finding him. We're gonna find him. So they kind of looked around the cave and the mouth of the cave where they had found shelter, and they did some investigation rolls, and thus began the charade that was them rolling dice, or the shenanigans that was them rolling dice. Because I'm going to tell you right now that for the most of our session, the majority of players really struggled on average to roll above a 10 on their D20, and it made everything more difficult than it needed to be. But again, the catchphrase of today's video is going to be more on that later. So they're doing some investigation, and eventually, due to some spells and some quick thinking and that kind of thing, what they wind up finding is some drag marks that are really hard to miss, or that are really hard to find rather, because the floor is stone, and it's not like there's a bunch of dirt to really easily. It's like stone floor with gravel and some dirt here and there, so they just faintly see these drag marks. So they say, well, we're going to follow these and see what happens. So they follow them, and eventually they follow them to this other little cave. It was, I said, it's like 15 minutes away from where you are, and you want to go in this cave. And everyone at this point, maybe it was a little bit of meta, maybe not. I mean, they are in the Underdark. Everyone at this point basically said, well, this just is terrible. Like, there's going to be something terrible in that cave, because our friend is gone. He's probably eaten by something, dragged off in the middle of the night, and now we're going in this cave. But again, the paladin was kind of like, no, we're doing this. So they went in, and I said, okay, so what you find is this cave, and the reason you had to go in, because a lot of them have dark vision due to being, half elf, half orc, dwarves, that type of thing. I said, well, the reason you couldn't see is because there's all these, and maybe someone in one of the comments here, because I'm far too lazy to Google, can clarify for me, is a stalagmite or a stalactite what grows up from the floor as opposed to down from a ceiling. Regardless, whatever it's called, there was a bunch of those that were quite large, like maybe the size of Eldith the dwarf, all said and done, right? So it wasn't like they had to go in to kind of get around these stone formations and see what was maybe in the back of this cave. So they go in, and what they find is that someone had taken some of like the glowing lichen or moss that was around some of the walls in the cave that they were staying in, had ground it into like a paste. So that it could be used to draw almost. And so what they find is that someone had done this. They had drawn weird, unrecognizable, rune characters or letter characters in a circle formation with some elegant kind of disconnected lines, making, again, this circle that was maybe like 10 feet in diameter. And then in the middle of this, they find, I basically described to them that, okay, so, and in the middle of this whole kind of collage is Prince Darendel. And at this point, some of the players were like, oh, okay, good, we found him. I wonder what he's up to. And then I said, and he's eviscerated. And he's cut open, from chin all the way down. And his rib cage is kind of like popped open like a butterfly. And all of his organs have been cut out and rearranged. And the paladin was so sad. The paladin was just like, I am going to find who did this and make them suffer. Now, I should mention that even before they set out on this kind of investigation to find what happened to him, there was some doubt or some suspicion cast towards Pepito, because Pepito and Prince Darendel had the last watch, and so when he disappeared, they were like, "Well, what did you like? Weren't you the last person to see him?" And Pepito, in his very kind of chipper attitude, said, "Oh yeah, like we were watching together, and he was actually a really good conversationalist, and then we were done, and we both went to bed, and I think I might have fallen asleep a little bit, and when I woke up, and now he's gone." And they were kind of okay with that at first, but now that he was dead, and upon investigation of the scene, it was very much what looked like a ritualistic killing. So, this wasn't some monster that decided to have a snack. And because upon investigation of the body, they found that in addition to the wounds being done by like something small like a dagger, and this was not a battle, obviously, and there was a lot of blunt force trauma to the back of the head. So someone had kind of knocked him out and dragged him away. So at this point now, they were really like, okay, something's off here. So the paladin was upset enough that he really went to work. He picked Pepito up, kind of broke his nose, and it was basically went all Christian Bale Batman on him, and eventually after being unable to get away, Bapito was thrown to the ground, and the order was given to kind of restrain him and question him and that kind of stuff. And so at this point, it's like, all right, well, maybe part of the jig is up, so to speak, when it comes to Bapito. So he starts, he's being thrown to the ground, and he's on his hands and his knees, and his head's down, and they just hear this soft laughter start to slowly turn into a cackle, and all of a sudden Pepito's manner totally changes from this chipper kind of, hey guys, I'm part of the team, to this more menacing kind of like, what do you think is going to happen here? And the characters, who I don't think have learned to be as afraid of things as maybe they should sometimes, or at least maybe they feel like they have more control than they actually do. I don't know, but they basically respond like, well, you're going to tell us what happened is what's going to go on here. And he basically says, no, I'm going to leave this cave and the divine work will continue. And at that point, they're like, well, this is not okay. So the bard, like not Bard the character, but Ken LaFleur, I should say, basically, I think cast, I don't remember what spell he cast, but it was something to restrain. It wasn't a charm. I don't know. But regardless, Bapito beat the DC of this spell. It was a fit of laughter. He basically wanted to make him the hideous laughter spell to just cripple him on the ground. He passed the check, though, and so he was laughing. And then I was like, oh, but it becomes very evident that he's not laughing at you because of your spell. He's laughing at your feeble attempts to basically affect him in some way magically. And so then what happens is, okay, so in your trying to put a spell on him and kind of being thrown off by this new person that you're witnessing, he takes a handful of gravel or dirt or whatever's nearby and kind of throws it in your eyes and makes a run for it. Because realistically, no matter what Bapito is, he is confronted right now by like 8 people in a small cave, and what he has, and the reason like they could confirm this as well, is when they threw him and he hit the ground, this kind of ritualistic looking dagger kind of clinked to the ground, shaken loose from under his tunic or something. So he's also to that effect unarmed at this point too. So he makes a dart for it. I say, all right guys, so what I'm going to get you to do is do a reflex saving throw for the people who are immediately confronting him. And if you roll well enough, then you'll have the reflexes to kind of grab this little darrow before he just slinks away. So everyone makes their roll, and ironically, the only one who got even close was Uta, the tortoise person, who the running joke continues to be that he's like a turtle person, but he seems to be the fastest, quickest one in the group. So he just misses. So it's like, oh well, you grab his shirt, but he's this wriggly little thing. So he just kind of squirms out of his shirt and takes off into the darkness, and you can hear his laughter kind of echo away. And I didn't really pick the characters' brains too much on what they thought about the outcome of that. Like, I don't know if some of them figure, oh, well, that was an interesting encounter and I guess it's over with. Or I don't know if they're thinking that, oh, Jesus, now is this like psychopath stalking us in the dark and it's only a matter of time until he strikes again. So we'll have to see what they wind up thinking about that one. But it was definitely a bit of a blow to the party because, last time they had lost Ront due to circumstance. And then this time, now another 2 NPCs are gone, one because they're murdered, and another because he was the murderer and has left and has gotten away. So now another, down 3 total from the initial starting 9 or 10. I can't remember how many there were. The other thing, though, that I found was interesting is that no one questioned the fact that Prince Darendelle didn't revert to an elven form after being basically massacred. And from a meta perspective, Darendelle was never an elf. He was a Quagoth the whole time. And he was basically just mad. He was insane. And he truly believed himself to be a prince. But he wasn't. He was just a Quagoth. So I don't know if the characters will ever, I guess, come into that information. They'll just go on the rest of their lives thinking, wow, we really let this elven prince down, and I hope no one finds out that he was murdered when we were there. But that was kind of another interesting point. So, so basically, this all happened, and we get the story back on track, so to speak. It was an 8-day travel process, and most of the time they went at a normal pace of travel, meaning that they had time to forage food and water, and there was no kind of disadvantage to them being ambushed or something like that. So they were moving along at a normal speed of travel, and I had pre-gen all the encounters that they were going to do beforehand during my prep. So I didn't have to waste a lot of time rolling dice to say, well, what's going to happen next? So they had a couple uneventful days of travel, and then they got into their first real kind of combat encounter. So they had, I was describing to them all the insanity that is the Underdark, and not insanity like chaos and action, but more like this is like, I know a few other people have said it too, on various other videos, that this campaign book is D&D's kind of dipping the brush a little bit in Alice in Wonderland and painting it D&D style through its own means. And so it's that idea of being in a completely strange and almost alien world from what's represented on the surface world where all these characters are from. So, it's traveling around. It's not like when you're on the surface and you're traveling around and going through meadows and forests and over mountains and things like this. It's you're underground, going from insanely changing landscapes, with 1 minute it being a tight, you know, passageway that only one person can fit through at a time, all the way to big, giant, wide open caverns filled with underground lakes or ceilings so high you can't see, giant forests of mushrooms of various size and looks, and the only thing they can hear is either their own breath or the dripping of water or something, the uncomfortable sound of something skittering across the stone somewhere else. So, it's very dark, and yes, a lot of the characters have dark vision, but it only goes out so far. So it's a really interesting kind of setting for them to be trekking their way through. So it's difficult to travel. They can only go so fast, even if they were going top speed type of thing. And they're, the whole time, unbeknownst to them, they were being tracked by this drow hunting party. And certain things will kind of cause them to catch up or not catch up or whatever. There's kind of like this pursuit level mechanic that can be affected in different ways. So so they enter into this room, and the idea here is that it's, they're not sure if they've stumbled into something's lair perhaps, or the scene of an ancient battle or whatever, but it is this giant cavern that is dimly lit due to, again, kind of like glowing fungus and stuff on the ceilings. But the entire room is just like a bone graveyard. Like, it's just filled with mounds of bones of various sizes and shapes, and one thing's not distinct from the other, and blah, blah, blah. And they did a couple checks, like, oh, do I know what this stuff is? Do I know where we might be? And again, their continuing plague of garbage rolls is hampering them. So he's like, no, you don't really know what this is. You can't recall anything historical that might have happened here. So odds are that maybe this is just the old den of some kind of predatory creature, blah, blah, blah. So eventually what winds up happening is Ken has this idea that basically says, well, the best thing to do is just announce our presence and see what happens. Very, very Obi-Wan Kenobi, I guess the next step is to spring the trap. So he picks up a bone that he sees on the ground and basically just starts smacking it against the wall and then whips it into the middle of the room. And I basically say, okay, so you do this, and you hear the noise of the banging and the clanging, and it hits something high up and falls and tumbles into the bone. But even after it comes to rest, it seems like the sound of the bones doesn't stop. And out of these kind of 3 different corners of the room, wading through the pile of bones, comes these 3 skeletal minotaurs. Right? And they look like they're created from a hodgepodge of things. Like, maybe they're not even true minotaurs. Like, maybe where the horns would be are like femurs. They just take the form of minotaurs, and they've got these giant, it looks like a giant size great axe with like a butcher cleaver for a head instead of your regular kind of curving axe blade. So this fight starts. And it was a really good combat. It was tough. I knew it would be kind of tough. The whole thing was a random encounter that I had rolled up, and I kind of got a lot of max rolls when I was doing that. So I thought, okay, well, let's test the party out and see what they're capable of. So they did this combat, and what I learned about these minotaurs was that they're really, really nasty when you first meet them, and then they get toned down a bit. And the reason that is because they have like a charge attack, and then what that basically says is that if they move at least 10 feet in a straight line and then do their kind of gore attack as opposed to hitting with their weapon, then if that hits, they get to do a certain amount of bonus damage that can be pretty nasty. And on top of that, they can actually knock their target down or push them back or whatever. Sorry, guys. So this happened like 2 out of the 3 times, and just like instantly dropped 2 of the fighter characters kind of thing. Now, what that really meant was not that the party was screwed, but just that the paladin now couldn't really do a lot of fighting. His job was now going to be to play medic. And so he was using his lay on hands to, if someone dropped, he would give them 1 HP and they'd stand back up again. And the reason that this really worked well for them is because in rolling initiative, he rolled garbage. He was basically going last, and a lot of the other characters rolled pretty high, and they were going first. So what the cycle kind of began about halfway through the combat was Minotaurs go, drop the fighting characters, and then the paladin goes, picks one of them up. The one he just picked up goes, deals some substantial damage, and then gets knocked down by the Minotaur again, because the Minotaurs, are kind of mindless. They're basically just undead, and they are still perceiving the greatest threat to them to be the thing that hit them the hardest the last time. So it became this really interesting mechanic of, all right, well, what something's going to give, what's going to give first? And so really, I guess just the highlights from that combat is, Utah did really well because all of his attacks were bludgeoning. So all the damage was being doubled. I was saying like, oh, your bow staff and your punches are really breaking bone and cracking and splintering the forms of these minotaurs. And so he was, also important to the fight. And, Ken LaFlaunt was kind of playing support. There was a lot of, okay, I cast Fairy Fire, and now you have advantage. And the other thing that the paladin could do was with his shield, because they leveled up to level 2 at the end of the last session, he could, with his shield, kind of impose disadvantage on someone within 5 feet of him as a bonus action. So he was helping out in that regard as well. But it started to get to a point where I was like, well, either just to make sure that this doesn't go too astray, or just to speed it up in some regard. Eldith, who is, again, that very kind of honor-bound shield dwarf, runs in from where the rest of the NPCs were kind of doing the rear guard thing, and charges in and says, "For Gonalgrim!" and just starts, taking on one of these 3 minotaurs, which is the one that's kind of being ignored, or the one that's kind of a pain in the butt. And thus begins the episode that is this NPC almost soloing this Minotaur. Not completely, but basically. Just fights this thing the whole time. The Minotaur couldn't roll to hit her to save his life, and she just hit every single time. And she's only got her little short sword that she was using kind of thing, because she was too weary to use the big warhammer kind of thing. But she's very selfless, and so she did what she could, and it worked out really well. So eventually they downed these 3 minotaurs, and it was pretty challenging. And I doled out the XP and everything, but it was definitely one of those things where I said, okay, well here has been a real combat, here has been a real challenge, and so we'll see what kind of winds up happening going forward. I know that I'll make some probably adjustments. I even made some adjustments on the fly. I wanted to play this session a little bit more chips where they fall, so I didn't do a lot of number fudging. To say, oh, well, I really don't want them to die here. I just kind of let it happen, and for the most part, that totally worked out. I will say that as part of the random encounter, there was actually supposed to be one other monster in the room, a violet fungus or something like that. And I just didn't want to do it. It just getting the top roll on D3 Minotaurs as 3 Minotaurs, that was a lot. They didn't have high AC, but they hit like a truck, and to throw another monster in there, even with Eldith helping, I didn't want to do that. So we finished up that combat, and so here's where the problem was, and where again a lesson was for me in terms of maybe what you'll call pacing or maybe difficulty or whatever. But because they stopped and were held up in this boneyard with these minotaurs and doing this combat, and yes, I know that there's, a round of combat's only 6 seconds, and they might have only been there for a minute of fighting, aka whatever. But the thing is that when they're fighting, they're not aware of their surroundings except for what they're doing. They're making a whole bunch of noise, and it basically says in the book that if a creature encounter happens, that the pursuit level goes up, and the pursuit level starts quite high when they escape, because they're just ahead of their pursuit party kind of thing. Like it doesn't take the drow too long to organize. Mr. Silvara, who is like the head honcho at this camp, is very upset with them, and so she wants to get this hunt going right away. So anyways, what winds up happening is they finish this combat, and many of them are at 1 HP, because the paladin just kind of keeps picking them up at 1 HP with lay on hands kind of thing. And eventually I say, okay, well, everyone do a perception check, or what's your passive perception? And they tell me, and I'm like, okay, well, as you're catching your breath, Ken experiences a little dart just bloop, right into his shoulder. So Ken, do a con saving throw for me. And once again, the player rolls were garbage, and so he failed, and so he falls unconscious. And I say to the rest of the party that you look at that dart and you recognize that to be like a poison drow crossbow bolt. So at this point, the forward scouts have caught up to them, and these four, and that's my dog if you can hear that, and these four drow kind of start pursuing them. And the player characters kind of look at each other, and they had just finished fighting these minotaurs, and I said, look, you have some options. You can stand and fight, or you can hoof it. And if you hoof it, there's basically going to be a chase sequence, because none of my players or even I had really done a chase before. So I kind of explained how that would work. And so they took in all that information and kind of got back into the setting of the role play. And the characters all looked at each other, just exhausted, and said, run. And so the half-orc picks up Ken and puts him over his shoulders, and they start making a run for it. And so this chase starts. And I wanted a way to, because we were getting late into the night as well, I wanted a way to kind of shorten up some of the encounters I'd rolled, and also make the chase interesting and give different opportunities. So one of the other random encounters I'd rolled was this idea of this giant 50-foot deep gorge with no bridge, like maybe the bridge had been destroyed or something. And there was just this little like 12 to 16-inch ledge along the wall that you kind of had to just shimmy through to get to the other side of this gorge. So I say, all right, so you're running and you're getting exhausted, and you come into this giant gorge, and you just kind of have to shimmy across. And my idea was that this presents an opportunity to get rid of one of the other random encounters, as well as give them an opportunity to potentially lose their tail, whether it be because the drow are too slowed down by this gorge, or because they use it as an opportunity to maybe fight them there and use the terrain to their advantage. I don't know. So here's where things really went sideways, and it was just very frustrating, I think, for everyone involved, including myself. And what happened was, so everyone's shimmering their way across, and it's a very low, like DC 10 dex saving throw, just to make sure you don't slip and fall 50 feet into the bottom of this gorge, right? So the half-orc bard, that his name's Bard, goes across carrying Ken. I said, oh, you kind of grab his wrist and you're dangling him down as you shimmy across. No problem. Uta goes. No problem. So now 3 of the 4 player characters are across the gorge. And the NPCs are keeping up, especially because most of the NPCs are quick, nimble little things anyways. They have no problem getting across. So they follow. So now it's the paladin's turn. Well, the paladin is, again, the lowest initiative order in this chase kind of thing, and he mucks up his dex roll and falls. And I looked for any reason in my head for him not to fall, but narratively, everyone else was across, and he was the last one to come through, and he fell. So I said, okay, well, you fall to the bottom of this 50-foot pit, and you're unconscious. And at this point, I didn't know what they were going to do. I don't think they knew what they were going to do. The drow are hot on their tail. One of their party members has just fallen into a pit. They do have rope. They have enough rope to go down there and get him. But, again, the drow are on their tail. So what winds up happening is these 4 drow catch up. And the first one starts to make his check to cross, and the first 3 are doing fine. The 4th one actually fails his roll, though, as well, just a bad roll. And he falls into the pit as well. And, you hear him scream, and then, as he hits the ground kind of thing. And so the players are kind of like, well, what do we do? What do we do? And so I said, okay. Just like I mentioned to you guys before, this was an opportunity to have the NPCs, play a part. So Eldith, that heroic shield dwarf, grabs Uta by his shell and kind of brings him down to her and says, I'm going to give you 2 things, and you have to promise me that they will reach my clan in Gauntlegrim, and pushes like her warhammer and her shield into his hands, and then basically takes her short sword and turns around and just lets out a battle cry and screams and runs at these other 3 drow who are just crossing this gorge, and basically throws herself into them, causing her and these other 3 drow all to tumble down into this gorge. And so everyone's like, oh my, what? And so they get the rope, and like the pursuit's over at this point. They get the rope and they climb down. And I say, okay, well, the scene before you is just, bodies littered, right? You've got the 4 drow, one of them just dead, maybe fell on his head as opposed to his back or something, I don't know. And then you've got the other 3 who are very badly injured, broken limbs, but they're unconscious, clearly still breathing. But, if no one attends to them or finds them, they'll probably just kind of bleed out in the dark down here. And then you've got Sir Robert, again, unconscious on the floor, sprawled out. And then you've got Eldith, and the players are like, well, if you're coming down to get this, it's not a big deal, we'll revive Eldith as well, and we'll all come up together. But I didn't want that. I didn't want that because it cheapened the whole experience. I would not have made Eldith play a sacrificial play, which is completely within her character to do, if the players had not rolled so poorly. And if the situation is not so dire. So I basically said, well, you find Eldith there, and she had the misfortune of landing on one of those like small stalagmites. So she was not impaled all the way through, but she was dead. And I said, you see her, and her head's cocked towards Sir Bastion, and there's one tear that had kind of rolled down her face, type of thing. And the players were like, oh man, that sucks. And there, another NPC gone, kind of thing. So where the situation gets even more of a debacle is that, again, super simple DC to climb down this rope 50 feet into this gorge. Fail. Character falls. 1 HP, goes down unconscious. Now, it almost turned into more than that with the second character climbing down. The same bloody thing happened. But then the half-orc basically said, oh, I missed something here on my character sheet. I have this resiliency power where, one time if I drop below 1 HP, I can just say nope and stand up again with 1 HP. So there's no need for there's no need for Uta to come down here because I fell, but I'm still up. And so there's no need for him to risk falling. And we said, yeah, okay, that's fine. So the half-orc basically grabs Sir Robert and again slings him over his shoulder, kind of thing, and starts to climb his way up. And we got up there, and so it was really difficult. They had one more encounter on their travels with just like a singular ochre jelly, and the ochre jelly was not very challenging, really. Although I think I did forget maybe one of its rules, but at the end of the day, low AC, doesn't do a lot of damage, doesn't have the kind of acid corrosion that can be a problem that gray oozes have. And because when they killed it, the monk actually killed it. So he kind of used flurry of blows to essentially pummel it into nothing. And so because of that, there was no kind of extraordinary circumstances that can sometimes happen when you kill one of these things through certain means and methods. So that was it. And so the way we ended off the session was essentially the players, finally make their way over the next bend, so to speak, and they can see Sloobludop in the distance. as this really interesting, glowy kind of tall, looks like reeds blowing in the wind, and they see a wall, but the wall is not like a traditional wall. It's like these giant poles in the ground with what looks like giant fishing netting that is interwoven between these poles, and then the fish nets are like just have like hooks and things dangling. So it's like a wall that's a hazard. It doesn't block sight, it just blocks movement, which was kind of neat. And so one thing I should mention too is that for some reason the whole time the players were very suspicious of Sereth, the drow NPC that's with them. Even though Sereth didn't really do anything, but they kept saying, well, look, every time Sereth is around, then like something happens after, you know, like he's in the back guarding with the other NPCs against the when we were fighting the Minotaurs, and yet somehow the drow sneak up on us. In fact, when that ambush happened, they thought Sereth had shot the dart. Which, I mean, hey, it's fair. He's a drow. You're running from the drow, so maybe there is something going on there. And then, of course, you know, Sir Robert had a conversation with Sereth. Or sorry, Ken had a conversation with Sereth just prior to the Ochre Jelly attacking. So like, circumstance, I don't know about this guy, so we're going to see what winds up happening with that. But essentially, they finally make it, and they're like, oh my god, 8 days of brutal travel and chase, and we finally made it to Slubluddop, and they're making their way towards, and I say, oh, and as you make your way up, just kind of from out of nowhere, these other Kuatoa that look like a way less chill version of Shushar the Awakened, who is the Kuatoa monk that they're traveling with, kind of have their, you know, very, very like, and I use a lot of Star Wars references, I know, but it's kind of like when the Ewoks capture, you know, the rebels on Endor. So it's just a bunch of these little crazy things with spears out, and one of them steps forward to talk, and it's a female Kuatoa, and she basically says in Undercommon, which two of the party speak, she says, well, who are you? Like in her, you know, like, who are you? Where are you from? And it was, you know, they're like, one of them, and it's Ken actually, kind of made the mistake of too much information. And he says, oh, like, we're from the surface and we're trying to escape and we need to get back, because they said, well, Slubluddop, they can help us maybe get back to the surface, right? It's a settlement of like real people and not like slave traders. And so he says this, and I said, well, as you mentioned the fact that you're surface dwellers, you know, a murmur goes around these Kuatoa that have their spears pointed at you, and the speaker, the one that's speaking, who they don't know much about who this is yet, basically says, oh, surface dwellers, oh, this is a great honor, and basically says, I claim you in the name of the Deep Father. And then that's where I called it. And I said, okay, well, we'll see what happens next time we get back. So the players don't know if this is like, oh, are we under your protection now? Or is it like you're dragging us back in handcuffs kind of thing? They don't know what that's going to mean. But I know that the next session, which at the very least will be Slubluddop, and maybe more depending on how long that takes. Well, like I said, one of the things I learned about today was travel pace, or not travel pace, but sort of like rate of play almost. And if I really look at it, the whole session was like 2 combats and a chase, with roleplay obviously sprinkled throughout. That's the meat and potatoes, right? And that took like the whole time. And I thought 8 days of travel with a few encounters, I thought, you know what, I really prepped well for the travel. I didn't prep as much for actually being a Slubluddop. And then when we started, I thought, oh, I've made a mistake here. I'm going to look a little bit unprepared, because they're going to get there really fast, because there's not that much going on in between. Well, I was wrong. The combat took longer than I thought. The roleplay took longer than I thought. You know, it was more difficult for them than I thought. So it worked out really well to end at a spot where it was like, okay, this session has been your first experience trekking and traveling through the nightmare that can be the Underdark, even though it's intermingled with all this beauty and alien strangeness. It's obviously very dangerous. And so now you end off finally emerging from these twisting caves that Sereth has been leading you through to Slubluddop, and you see the city, and you're so close to safety, and then these Kuatoa are like, well, you're coming with us. And so, yeah, that's where we ended off, and we're going to see what things look like next time around. But I know there's some really cool stuff coming up, and my learnings from today is that maybe the next session will just be Sloop Blue Dot. But if not, I'll have my random encounters rolled up for their travels forward after that. Where they go, I don't know. Just talking to the Paladin at one point, kind of meta, kind of him talking to NPCs was the idea of, okay, well, we're going to Sloop Blue Dot because it's close, and he really wants to go to Blingden Stone. Is where he keeps bringing up. And I'm like, well, Blingden Stone's pretty far, but to be honest with you, the locations you are aware of after Sloop Blue Dot are kind of, here's Sloop Blue Dot, and then here's, Neverlight Grove up here, and then here's Gracklestug and Blingden Stone. So at this point, Gracklestug and Blingden Stone are equidistant from Sloop Blue Dot, but Neverlight Grove is closer to Gracklestug, let's say, I think, or even that's equidistant between the two of them. I can't remember which. But either way, the whole conversation said, well, we'll do Sloop Blue Dot, and then depending on what happens, maybe we'll continue our travels to Gracklestug, where there is a big city and real civilization as opposed to this little village encampment that the Kuatoa have. And then, just logistically speaking, we can go from Gracklestug to Neverlight Grove, which will basically be on the way to Blingden Stone, is how he kind of mapped it out in his mind. And I said, yeah, that makes complete sense to me. So whether or not they stick with that plan, I don't know. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that plan. They could wind up going somewhere else too. But I like the plan that they have, and we're going to see if they stick with it. So that's basically how session 2 went for Out of the Abyss. I should have mentioned at the start of the video, but my name again is Anthony, and I've been enjoying the experience as the DM for this a lot. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in another week with our update after the players deal with Sloop Blue Dot. Thanks.